caused by Hurricane Hazel. This presentation will not by any chance, by any means, be covering every event of that night. We just couldn't do it. What I'm looking at, or what I'm hoping, is that basically it's meant to cover what happened in Weston and the close neighbors, basically during and afterwards. Now you can follow the route of the presentation on your map. Now the numbers might be kind of tiny for the dark, but hopefully you'll be able to do it. Now, over the years, criticism has been made over the years about people not leaving their homes, no warnings being given by the news media, and the prevailing ignorance when it came to hurricanes. I hope this presentation will help you understand how things were at that time and on that night. So look at your handout if you like. You can. The one side mentions the Humber watershed and the Humber River facts. Basically, some of that information is good to know, again, to understand what happened. Now, another thing to know to understand how things went that day or that night, basically, is to understand the meteorology of the day. So they had everything that was to do with weather, that was weather related, came from the Dominion Weather Office, and that was at Malton, which is basically Pearson Airport, right? They did have hurricane hunters, they did have weather balloons, and they had weather stations, and these had actually become a little bit more sophisticated because of World War II. They were needed to be, and so, but there was one thing that was missing. Can anybody guess what that one thing was? Well, computers. See, and without computers, all the computations and calculations had to be done by hand. Now, data was collected every 12 hours by groups of technicians who then plotted their observations onto large-scale maps that were then analyzed and interpreted by a team of meteorologists. Forecasting was done with information that was 12 to 14 hours old. So although it was done very well, the information they came up with was considered state-of-the-art. There was no fault at all there, but it was still with old data. Now back then, there were no classification scales, no weather warnings, and no weather watches either. They did have special weather bulletins, but they had no standard way of, or standard system of when to release them or even for what they were supposed to say. And even if they did release this information, no one knew, there was no explanation of what huge amounts of water and wind would do. They just didn't know back then. Now, another thing to understand for 1954 was the way the media worked. Back before the internet and social media, of course, the few weather forecasts that were to be had came from, in Toronto, the three newspapers, or Weston, 3 newspapers, plus radio, plus TV. And even a lot of people still didn't even have a TV. And these 3 sources got all their information from the Dominion Weather Office. Back then, weather radar was sketchy. There certainly were no, satellites, that's it, sorry. There were no satellite images, and of course there was no weather network. And basically these ones would have been there to explain what was going on, but they weren't. And there was also no opportunity to break into any forecast. I'm sure everyone has been watching or has watched TV when all of a sudden it's that we interrupt this broadcast. Well, they didn't do that back then because they basically didn't have the facilities they didn't have the ability to do it. Now, and even when the newspapers did have the information, see what would happen is the newspapers would get that information and then they'd write it out in their own words. And sometimes the accuracy and certainly the immediacy, the danger would be downplayed. Not intentionally, but it's just, again, they didn't know. Like for example, this one says you better take a hold of your hat. Well, it's just way too mild for what was going to happen. And even this picture of the man bailing out his basement, that's the night before. And I mean, he's almost smiling. And so you see that again, like I said, the urgency was just not relayed. And again, it's no fault through the newspapers, because it does say hurricane years, fear record rain, but they didn't know what record rain would do. No one knew what, that much water could do to a house, or do to a tree, or do to anything like that. And there were also other circumstances too. See, hurricanes need warm water to be created, and also to last. And that's why they generally form around the equators. And what happens though is when they head north, they hit land. And on top, not only do they hit land, and that gets rid of a lot of their power, then they'll also hit mountains. And mountains will do it even more, release even less of, or sorry, their power goes down even more. And of course, there'd always been lots of lands, and there'd always been the mountains in the way, so hurricanes just did not reach southern Ontario. Now, because they knew the Humber could naturally take up to 63,000 liters of water per second. Okay, that cube represents 1,000 liters of water. So the Humber Valley could actually take 63,000 of those without any problem, without any flood control systems in place. And so they'd never been put in place because it just had never been a problem. There were no emergency plans. There were no civil defense organizations trained to handle such a situation because it hadn't been needed. Now, then came October 1954. A month and a half worth of rain had fallen in the 16 days before Hurricane Hazel. The clay soil of the Humber Valley, and that's what the Humber Valley was made of, clay, basically was full. It could not hold any more water. So, and creeks and rivers were already, that fed into the Humber River, were already flowing briskly. And then came Hazel. Now Hazel was spotted down, you see down at the bottom, Hazel was spotted on October 5th in the Caribbean Sea. First it was a tropical storm, and then it was a hurricane.
Like today. Sorry? Like today.
Yeah, actually like today. And it also crossed over Haiti and killed 1,000 people. It hasn't killed that many people, but it definitely has gone that route. Then it turned northwest to the US coast. It's sounding very familiar, doesn't it? On page 32, the Globe and Mail mentioned it. Neither one of the other papers did. The Dominion, then on October 14th, the Dominion Weather Office said it would reach the east end of Lake Ontario if the Allegheny Mountains didn't stop it. See, once again, everybody knew those mountains were there, so they weren't worried. And again, on the 14th, this is the day before it hit, the Toronto Star was the only one that mentioned it, and they did mention it on the first page. Sorry, I went too far. Hang on a second. We're still here. We're still on the 14th, okay? But on the 15th, now this is noon, on the 15th, Hurricane Hazel made landfall in the on North Carolina coast, sorry, South Carolina. And the Dominion Weather Office bulletin said that they felt it would die out, and it seemed to be doing, and it really did seem to be doing just that. It was going north, and it was getting weaker and weaker. That was, like I said, that was at noon. Now, 4:30, between 4:30 and 6:30, which isn't all that much later. So it may be dying out, but it's still moving. It was still moving very quickly. And what they call remnants of Hurricane Hazel arrived south of the Great Lakes, merged with a trough of cold air, becoming extratropical. So a lot of people class the hurricane, or the storm, I should say, that came to the Great Lakes, they class it as Hurricane Hazel 2. They don't even consider it the same storm, because it was dying out, and then it hit this trough of warm air, and then, this trough of cold air. Then what happened, it hit another band of warm air coming from the east. And so it just excelled and became extratropical, is what they call it. Right. And now this was by, like I said, by 4:30 to 6:30. Then it hit and it stalled and basically dropped all of its moisture all at once. All three newspapers carried the story on the front page, but like I said, this was between 4:30 and 6:30. By that time, it was really too late because, of course, then came the flood. Water was collecting in underpasses. People coming home from work were stepping off the bus into ankle-deep water. Highways began to suffer washouts, and creeks were forming where they'd never been before. Woodbridge, and this is Woodbridge, was the first community on the Humber to be hit. Millions of tons of water crashed down onto a trailer park. That's Woodbridge, you can see, and all that water was heading to Weston. Now, Fairglen, Crescent, Maple Bush, and D Avenue, three nice little streets just above Weston, situated on the flats, what they call the flats, which basically were right by the river, and they were about 50 feet lower than the rest of the street. Now, there were about 15 houses, similar to this one, most built before the Depression. A few, if any, even had basements. Traveling 4 times faster than it normally would, the water indiscriminately destroyed everything in its path. And those two pictures that you just saw, the one before and this one now, those are basically before and after pictures. That's where the house was. Carrying all kinds of debris, the river forced houses off their foundations, pushing them along to hit other houses still standing, or to simply fall apart, or to cause more trouble farther down. Some people were still awake and had a chance to climb to their roofs or porches, possibly even to be rescued.
Jim Crawford, a 23-year-old off-duty police officer, got to the river just when Herb Jones, a local contractor, was asking for help. Herb wanted to help rescue those in trouble with his 14-foot boat, and Jim agreed. That night, Herb Jones and Jim Crawford were able to bring more than 50 people to safety. Jim held a spotlight to help guide Herb along the way. Sorry, I have a prop here.
That's the spotlight?
That's the spotlight.
Okay.
We made our way out into the tumultuous waves and currents of the river. Jones soon impressed me with his expertise as the whiplash handling of his boat has been maneuvered between the houses, picking trapped tenants from rooftops, from porches, from garage roofs, and some who had even slid down the sides of their houses on rope-type threads of sheets from bedroom windows and onto our boat. We bounced about crazily like a small cork, the boat literally at times almost standing on its end as we made our way back to the shore with our precious cargo aboard. At one point the motor broke down because the shear pin was broken. I held onto a tree to keep us from being carried downstream and aimed the spotlight so Herb could see to make the repair. When there were no more houses because the street was gone, we went home. I guess it was worse for Herb. Herb couldn't swim.
This is Herb, and I've forgotten his name.
Jim Crawford.
Yes, Jim Crawford, sorry. This is an example of one of the houses when he just mentioned how people climbed out the window with the sheets hanging out. And this is what was left of the street once the Hurricane Hazel passed. Now the next stop on Hurricane Hazel's voyage was the St. Philip's Bridge. Built in 1910, St. Philip's Bridge was the longest concrete arch bridge in Canada at that time. It was held in place by the abutments buried deep. So you can see that's the bridge, but basically the bank goes right up to the edge, and the abutments, which are they're also called approaches, were buried deep in the bank of the valley. When the massive debris hit the bridge, it acted like a dam. causing the water to rise very quickly. This undermined and washed away, you can see where it washed all away, washed away the abutments and the approach on the Etobicoke side. The bridge itself held firm.
At nearly midnight, Constable Dick Stock of the Toronto City Police was sent with other officers to the Weston Police Station to assist rescue workers. He was told there were houses coming down the Humber River and was ordered to St. Philip's Bridge to watch for the swimming victims. When he arrived at the crumpled bridge, a house was just going under.
When the house hit the bridge, it simply exploded as if a bomb had hit it. As the remains of the house disappeared down the raging river, I heard a scream for help. At the broken end of the bridge, I could see a man holding onto a branch about 20 feet from the west shore. Everyone seemed to just stand there and look at him. I peeled off my tunic, gun belt, and hat, and eased myself into the swollen river toward the screaming man. The current was tremendous. For every 2 feet forward, I was carried 6 feet downstream. I pulled myself along a branch, and when it broke, I leaped for another branch and hung on. I really thought I was a goner. Suddenly the man was floating past me, and I made a grab at him and missed by inches. I shall never forget his face. It was then someone on shore began throwing a rope to me. After several tries, it landed across my shoulders and caught on the branch where I could grab it. I was lucky. I was pulled to safety.
Another view of the bridge. Another view of the bridge. You can see how the abutment got washed away. Now the next bridge was the Lawrence Avenue West Bridge. This bridge had been built in 1940 to replace the old iron bridge. Again, the bridge held while the abutment and the approach did not.
It was well past 1 o'clock in the morning near Lawrence Avenue and Weston Road. The rain was as wild torrent, and at times visibility was so limited if one were driving, they would be driving blind. At the police precincts, distress calls were jamming the switchboards. Ed Pearson, originally from England and who served in World War II, had become a Toronto policeman.
Hardest hit that Friday night was Toronto's West End, where I was posted. I'd been assigned the duty of preventing traffic from crossing the Lawrence Avenue Bridge, where the raging Humber River was rising dangerously high. This was no easy task in the complete darkness with howling winds and torrential rain, not to mention people honking horns and expressing displeasure as I gestured them away while furiously blowing my police whistle. They became more appreciative of my efforts when the front section of the bridge collapsed and was sent hurtling down the river. I heard an officer at the Humber River begging his home station, "I need help. A family. I think there are 3 kids. They're trapped. The water's rising fast. My God, they've been swept away. Even the media's huge spotlights can't find them."
This is the dispatcher. I had a report that 2 men are trapped in a house south of the bridge. Do not launch any boats. I repeat, do not launch any boats. They would capsize. Anyone who can hear me out there, proceed to Lawrence Avenue Bridge to offer assistance.
Again, you can see this is the abutment this time washed away on the western side, not on the Etobicoke side. Now also buried under the bridge was Weston's main telephone cable. It was severed during the storm, and as a result, many of the people on the Cherry, is what it was called, the Cherry Exchange in Weston, were without phone service. And the collapse of these bridges basically cut Weston off from anything over on the western side. And it basically, we lost that traffic link completely. Next is the Weston Arena. On November 25th, 1949, the Weston Lions celebrated the opening of the new arena after a great deal of fundraising, including a lucky draw for a $10,000 bungalow. Just 5 years later, Hurricane Hazel swamped the new facility with 5 feet of water. The next morning, when the building was assessed for damage, mud and silt covered everything up to the high water mark, but the building remained solid. Now south of the arena was the tennis courts and the club rooms. There was also the lacrosse box, dressing rooms, and bleacher seats. All of these, plus 6 acres of seeded playing field, were wiped out. When the water receded, there were 2 motor cars, a truck, and a tanker trailer had been deposited in the center of the field.
The automobiles left behind were an example of how fast and how powerful the river really was. With everyday objects turned into lethal missiles, rescue attempts were thwarted time and time again. Police, volunteer firemen, and everyday citizens would be close enough to hear and see the people in distress, but sometimes there was nothing to be done. Even when the right equipment did arrive, rescue attempts were incredibly dangerous. Members of the fire department tried using a boat with a rope tied to it. They were almost swamped when the rope extended to its maximum length.
We were within hearing distance of those awful screams from women and children, leaning out windows and hanging onto rooftops. But we couldn't get close to them until we got the boats, and even when they came, some of them were too small. If you didn't have a 15 horsepower motor, it was no good. Until we got the boats, there was nothing we could do. You couldn't drive into torrents of water because your car would be rolled away. You had to watch the high power lines that were coming down, but mostly all you had to do was wait for boats.
We can't see that house with the people on the roof that you sent us to find near the Weston Arena.
Move about 600 yards south. That's probably the one I saw floating past a few minutes ago. They'll be about 600 yards south by now.
The next area that got swamped would have been the Weston sewage plant. Now, it was a combined system that took household catching sewage from the houses and also stormwater that happened to fall. The large cement tanks that with their massive twirling arms, now they would be okay because they were used to being underwater, but lying exposed in the sediment, in the huge sedimentation tanks or the vast drying beds, the sewage and waste would be swept down the river along with all the other debris. To add insult to injury, the town dump was just south of there, and it got swamped also. I'm sure almost every one of you have heard of the swing bridge that goes over the Humber River to the Westmount area. Now, there had been a footbridge in this area since 1912. Ironically, over the years, it has been replaced a number of times due to flooding. It has, now neither one of these pictures are the one that got washed away. Basically, it's not this one either. Because it got condemned it got condemned in late 40s and basically rebuilt in the 50s. And this is the only picture we've managed to find that even has a piece of it. We have many pictures that everyone thought that's one that got washed away from in Hazel, and it wasn't. The next stop along the way was Raymore Drive. Now, Raymore Drive was basically a quiet little residential street nestled on the flatlands and sheltered by a gentle bend. You can see there's the river, and there's Raymore Drive that went around, and then this little street that cut across it was Gilhaven Avenue. Now the 1- and 2-story cottage-like houses, now they were wood houses, but they were also brick houses too, were well taken care of and comfortable, except for that pesky spring flooding that just, caused a little bit of trouble.
Some people had lived there more than 50 years without the water causing any undue concern. So when it was suggested on Friday night that residents seek higher ground or go to the Army-Navy Club on Kingdom Street, only a few heeded the advice. When the power failed around 10:30 p.m., most people who had TV turned them off and went to bed. David Phillips recounts what he saw.
Houses were floating down the river, and some had smashed into the swing bridge, putting it under a severe strain. Debris continued to pile up against the wire ropes. Then I saw the westerly abutment of the bridge tear loose, while the easterly abutment stayed firm. The wire ropes which supported the platform of the bridge itself also held firm, allowing the current to swing the bridge in a slight arc before it stopped in such a way that all the debris coming down the river built up against the wire ropes, still connecting the westerly and easterly abutments. The normal flow of water was stopped, and then suddenly the water was diverted in a tidal wave right across the floodplain that was Raymore Drive. The homes were literally lifted off their foundations and swept away. You could hear the people screaming, many of them standing on their roofs. In many cases, the screaming just stopped. The home just disintegrated. That was the end.
If you take a look at this picture very closely, you can actually see a helicopter lifting people off the roof. And we have a series of these pictures, and it shows the helicopter coming in, getting closer, hovering over the roof, and then taking off. So the next morning, Raymore, 1,200 feet of Raymore Drive and Gilhaven Avenue had been swept away. 14 houses were no longer there, and 36 people were gone. The street was left a sopping mess. You can see now you can see where the river goes, and the street's gone. Was left a sopping mess strewn with rocks, boulders, and debris. Now St. Matthias was a little church that was built in 1895, and it was moved to its present location on Scarlet Road, and if you can see on your map, you'll see what I'm talking about, in 1922. Reverend Paul Glover, deacon to St. Matthias, sent his father a telegram.
Tragedy has struck my parish. Many dead. Others lost their homes. Please pray and appeal for assistance.
About 1/3 of his congregation was lost. Now, after Hurricane Hazel rampaged through, there was obviously the aftermath after the water started to recede. Over 200 volunteers probed the wreckage for bodies for up to a week after the storm. They patrolled and searched the riverbanks, sometimes with their bare hands, and even the Boy Scouts were asked to come out and help.
My brother, James Cassidy, was a Boy Scout. He was just short of 17 years old. It was a great adventure going down the river after the hurricane because they were sent as scouts to find what they could find. And they did find one person who had drowned and was covered in mud. And my brother came home a very, very sober boy.
Volunteers manned temporary phone lines to let people know the status of their loved ones. Bill Bursell from Weston, he was a ham radio operator, and he basically set up his own system so that there would be some, because remember, the telephone lines are gone, so he set up his own system so that the police would be in contact, but mostly they'd be in contact with the Salvation Army and the relief efforts. Everyone from everywhere, police, firefighters, and ordinary citizens were praised for coming together and working tirelessly to help out. This one, it says basically forget the prisoners, leave the prisoners in the jails, or even on the way to the jails, and it says bring the wagon up to Weston, it's needed. Now St. Matthias, neighboring housewives and other people who had not been struck down by the tragedy worked in shifts all day Saturday and Sunday, supplying coffee and sandwiches for those people who were looking for the bodies. Meals, clothing, and temporary lodging were arranged for those who had homes but had been swept away. According to one volunteer,
donated clothing and blankets were piled on the pews until the pile reached almost to the ceiling, were distributed, and more came in to replace them.
Clothing was accepted by 4 centers in Weston: the Fire Hall, Legion Hall, Town Hall, and the Salvation Army, then immediately taken to areas where it was needed. The Weston Town Hall was used as a registration office for survivors, and a depot for donated items, and a depository for donations to the Ontario Hurricane Relief Fund. Everybody donated. If you look, the turkey shoot netted $500, and they gave it all to the relief fund. And its cleaners, they didn't give money, but they offered anybody who had clothing or blankets or anything that had been damaged in the flood, they offered to clean them. They ended up taking 5,773 orders. And those were just orders, so there could have been who knows how many pieces within those orders. And the newspaper, the local Times and Guide, the Weston Times and Guide, the pages were just full of the number of people who donated. they also stopped and took time to mourn.
Weston people, mindful of their loss, paused in their daily business and bareheaded, lined the funeral route when 9 of the flood victims were taken from Ward Funeral Home to various churches, and then moved slowly to the cemeteries.
And then, of course, started the cleanup and the rebuilding. On October 22nd, the Army was sent into the Humber Valley with bulldozers and flamethrowers to burn up the mess, as 800 militia joined soldiers still searched for 16 missing people. Rebuilding started almost immediately. That's the Lawrence Avenue Bridge, basically. Bridge being temporarily opened on October 25th, and then St. Philip's followed shortly after that. St. Philip's opened with a big crack in it, but apparently it was considered safe. Sounds a little bit scary to me, but they used it for a long time. Now, oddly enough, even though the bridges were fixed, traffic was really crazy in Weston, and that's because the bridges north of Weston or around Weston were not fixed. And so everybody was coming through the town, through Weston, in order to get from east to west, because it was the only way to be able to do it. The arena managed to get to work immediately also. Within 2 days, the building had been thoroughly cleaned and the electrical equipment was in the process of being overhauled. A week after the flood, the arena was in full operation.
What would perhaps seem a little bit lighter, the Lions, of course, had been instrumental in the building of the arena. And my father was very active in the Lions Club, and he was also on the arena board. He was the secretary-treasurer. And being a very methodical man, one of the big concerns were all the records, which were stored at the arena and were thoroughly soaked by the flood. So he brought all the records home to our house and put newspapers down on the living room floor and carefully separated out each page of the records to dry on our living room floor. I always felt my mother showed great forbearance because she'd said not a word to him as he went about saving the records of the Lions Club and the Weston Arena.
Now the tennis courts and the playing field actually were in danger of not being rebuilt simply because it was going to be too much money. But they ended up raising $2,200, and so the bulldozing, leveling, seeding, and fertilizing began. And they were able to get the courts back up within a couple of months. Now, oddly enough, and I didn't even think of this at the time, but Hurricane Hazel also caused an incredible housing shortage, because it was within as many as 4,000 homes destroyed. So this is an ad in the Weston Times and Guide to the flood victim looking for a place to live. There was a huge shortage. Now, Hazel by the numbers, and what I mean by that is if you look at the handout I gave you, it talks about how much rain fell, how much water that is, and that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go through all that. You're welcome to take that home and look at it. But what I wanted to remind you was, remember when I said 63,000 liters? That's how much the river could take. Well, Hazel dropped almost 5 million. Liters of water. So that's 78 times of what the valley was actually able to take. So you can understand why there was such disaster as there was. Now, Hazel's legacy, thank heavens there has been some good come out of all this. In the year 2000, Maclean's magazine ranked Hurricane Hazel as one of the top 50 nation-building events of the 20th century. Little St. Matthias was designated under the Ontario Heritage Act in 2003 with specific reference to the significant contribution of the church and parishioners during the Hurricane Hazel and the days immediately following. Now, Hurricane Hazel also changed the thinking about conservation in South Central Ontario. People realized the trees absorb water, not pavement. Hazel brought a regional approach to flood control and water management in Ontario. Before Hazel, there had actually been 4 conservation associations trying to work things out. But with Hazel, what happened was they all joined together and became the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And its mandate was to manage watershed, have watershed management and sustainability practices. They built, 4 dams were built on the Humber, basically as a part of a flood control system. And a flood forecasting and warning system was created so that, which monitors watershed conditions. 326 square miles of parkland were created over the Toronto area and halting the building of homes on the floodplains. And if you'll notice, please notice the park names, Crawford Jones Memorial Park. Remember, those are the 2 guys up at the north end. And of course, Raymore Park, and we have Lions Park, Weston Lions Park. Also, the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Scale was created, and this it tells you the different class, whether category 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or 5. They figure Hurricane Hazel would have been a class category 4, and I believe that's what they're saying Matthew is right now too. 5. Is it? Okay.
Yes.
Anyways, now also in 1971, first with obviously with computers. With the advent of computers and technology, meteorology has come a long way, and they've established standards for weather bulletins, weather watches, and weather warnings, and advisories too. Also, Environment Canada was established in 1971, and one of the first things they did was retire the name of Hazel. Thank you. Any questions? Anybody want to relate any of their stories?
Great.
Go ahead.
My parents moved to the area on Jane Street that faced Black Creek Drive, or Black Creek. And of course now it is Black Creek Drive. But in 1954, I was in bed with, I think mononucleosis or something, some teenage thing. And I can remember that night seeing the water rushing past my bedroom window, and we lived on top of the high area. If you've driven on that drive, you know that there's quite a deep section all the way along that is the riverbed. That complete bed was filled with water. And I could see the water rushing by. It's just a personal memory.
What about the noise? Was it loud?
Yes, I could hear it.
That's what other comments I've read about too, that the noise was just incredible. Yes?
Sorry, I lived in Dennis, and I'm Weston Road, and when we look out of our front door window, second story window, I could see the Eglinton Flats. At that time Jane Street went through, but Eglinton wasn't complete. And I used to live with a Globe and Mail, and I got up about 5 in the morning. Didn't know anything about it was some rain, but didn't know anything about any of that, what was happening up in Weston. But I looked out, and there's some lights down in the flats, because there were Chinese farmers, and then anyway, I could see reflection. That's strange. So I went and did the papers. Later that morning, rode my bike down Close Avenue, down Outlook rather, going down by Roseland School, the Scarlet Road, and the water was rushing over the bridge there. But I could see the Queensbury Arms. You can see the high water mark just below the second story windows, but it had fallen. Oh, yeah. Just like the tide was in and the tide was out. Yeah. So it was, and then my friend and I, we rode across Jane Street down, and the water was still running across Jane Street, but they let us do it on their bikes. But we had no idea at that time of the destruction.
That happened a lot. Like people in Weston had gone to bed, and of course Weston's high. So from that point of view, they like you said, nobody knew what had happened. Martin?
Just in keeping with Arnold Humber, who just recently passed away, the Western Golf Course held the 1955 Canadian Open, and they had to rebuild the lower part of the golf course because it got so badly damaged by the flooding.
Yeah,
So that was a big challenge for them in '55.
because actually before, after Fairview, or Fairglen, and then before the St. Philip's Bridge was the Western Golf and Country Club. And like you said, they got washed out too. So. The interesting thing was, or one of the interesting things was the PM, Louis St. Laurent. He basically sent a telegram to Weston offering condolences for the people who had passed away in Hurricane Hazel. And the town actually had to send a letter back saying, well, actually nobody in Weston did pass away. It was all around. So it was kind of a little bit of embarrassment for the Prime Minister. Somebody else? Yes?
My mom's grandmother, I think her house, it was like, I think it was damaged by the Hurricane Hazel, and I usually go for walks like in the bridge, I think, St. Philip's Bridge. Yeah, St. Philip's Bridge.
Right.
And I seen like this big stone that was knocked down from the Hurricane Hazel.
Wow. And it did. It moved huge stones, and those abutments that got washed away were like, they're huge. Yes.
I was aware of various people they've spoken about. We were in a group of 4 Rover Scouts, and that night, I forget what we'd been to, but we were all dressed up. We were wearing suits, and we were driving a car. Frank Best was his car, and it was Jim Britton and Jerry Stanley and me. I'm Don Lane, and I was a student minister at the time at Riverview United Church. Now, that Riverview wasn't quite in view of that river, but somehow they called it that. And the 4 of us ended up down there on Fair Glen Crescent at the top left-hand side of your map. And you couldn't imagine what it was like for us there. People were standing on the roof of their homes, and the lights were still on and hadn't even shorted out the lights. And all of a sudden, along would come either another house, but more often a garage. Hit the end of it, tip it over like that, and it was gone, and the people were gone. And we watched so many people there that night. And we were standing with a family of people who'd come from Holland. And they'd had terrible floods in Holland at the time, and they said, we came here to find a new life, and look what's happened. But tonight, I really want to congratulate all of you who put this together. This was just excellent. It's the best I've ever seen. Just another word on a previous thing. When my wife Judy was talking about that great trip we took to the Holland Marsh, with all its Dutch people and so on, Holland has nothing to do with the Dutch. Holland was the name of a government person that they sent out